All right. So my name is Jessamy Rahman Clapper. I'm the Director of Programs and Operations at Pillars of Peace, and I'm also a social worker and therapist who's been working in the field of gender-based violence for the past several years. And I'm joined tonight by our case manager, Tamanna Khan. If you want to unmute so that you kind of pop up for people to see you.
Hi, thank you guys for coming. I'm gonna be like moderating the chat, and if you guys have any questions and stuff, like feel free to, or comments, feel free to put it in the chat and I'll, tell Jessamy for you.
Yes, and share with the group. We do have some different discussion questions throughout, and then depending on timing, we may have time for additional questions at the end. So we'll try to just launch into it and get started. So just to begin, a little bit of information about Pillars of Peace. I'm going to read this statement because it is a little bit long. But this is our mission. Pillars of Peace is dedicated to creating culturally and linguistically conscious, trauma-informed communities of care by, for, and among survivors of domestic and gender-based violence. While we welcome survivors of all faiths and communities, we are especially dedicated to filling a gap in services for survivors from Muslim communities. We understand that survivors from Muslim communities face specific multifaceted barriers to accessing services, regardless of their personal relationship with their heritage, faith, or community. And as such, Pillars of Peace seeks to uplift the intersectional complexity of both survivors and Muslims while creating judgment-free spaces for them to find support and healing. While we aim to start with providing direct services, we also know that gender-based violence is a complex problem involving many social and structural factors. Our mission is to not only help survivors transition out of crisis and abuse, but to work against the myriad factors that contribute to gender-based violence. So tonight's offering and our other webinars are kind of straddling the gap between those direct services that we're providing as part of our mission and also our social change of trying to make sure that more people in general are more aware of these issues and aware of how to support one another when they're dealing with them. So you can review some of these things, but this is just to give you a little bit of a sense of the organization if you haven't been familiar with it before. And now on to our main topic. So narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder have gotten a lot of attention in the media lately over the past several years. And one very obvious reason is our former president, Mr. Trump, who very famously, many people pointed out that he had many characteristics, if not all, of a narcissistic personality disorder. But there's also fictional and other media that sometimes can portray what narcissism or narcissistic abuse might look like in different situations. So I don't know if anyone has seen The Undoing or read the book that it was based on. You should have known, but the character in that book also is a really classic presentation of narcissistic personality disorder. And one of the things it illustrates is how much a person who is in a close relationship, in this case a marriage, with somebody who has that presentation, it can really overwhelm their entire way of living, and that person can influence how they see other aspects of their life. So if you haven't read it, I'm not going to do any spoilers, but the gist of it is that over the course of the book or the film, she uncovers evidence that shows her that the version of reality that she was getting from her husband, and in many cases didn't even realize he was providing to her, was completely separate from real life. And this is the experience of a lot of survivors of abuse who happen to be in relationships with somebody who is very sophisticated in using tactics of psychological abuse. it might not always seem obvious. The person may not be explicitly forbidding you to spend time with family or friends, but they may be sowing seeds that rupture those relationships, and it results in the same thing, that kind of isolation and control over the victim. So given that there have been so many conversations in the media and online, a lot more people have gotten exposed to the term narcissism, to the diagnosis, narcissistic personality disorder. And so we'd actually really like to hear from you what your exposure has been to these terms and what your understanding is of what narcissism is, or what a narcissist looks like in life and in relationships.
Okay, we have a couple of answers. Someone said someone being like often deceptively charming, and then someone who lacks empathy and is self-serving in relationships, being self-centered and self-absorbed. And I'll
Okay.
keep telling you.
Yeah, any more?
No empathy.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the key things that people are getting from these discussions is that somebody who's narcissistic is selfish, self-absorbed, and lacks empathy for
Yeah.
other
We
people.
also have like a couple more. Someone's
Sure.
also said a need for admiration, and someone who would harm people to get their needs met. And then we also have a question, which I think you might address after, but can someone be abusive but not narcissist, or do they coexist?
Yes, so that's actually one of the things that we're going to discuss in depth. Narcissistic personality, so the qualities that you've all mentioned, like somebody who really either has no empathy or really struggles to find empathy for other people, somebody who is self-absorbed, who constantly like has a need for admiration and attention, who may harm others to get their needs, to get that need for admiration met. Those are all characteristics or traits that actually can be found in other people who do not meet the criteria specifically for this diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. And there is only a very small percentage of the population who meet that criteria, but abuse is much more common. So one of the things that we're going to be going over today is, first, what's the value of understanding what narcissism is and what this disorder can look like? And then what else is helpful? Because for a lot of people, it's not going to necessarily be true that the abusive person in their life is a narcissist, but they're still causing them a lot of harm. So, like I mentioned, it's anytime that you're dealing with a diagnosis, there has to be some structure and limitations to it. So for somebody who is going to be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, they need to have a pervasive pattern of grandiosity or exceptionalism, like the need to be or feel that they are exceptional in some way from other people, need for admiration, and lack of empathy, beginning at least by early adulthood and present in a variety of contexts. So there may be people who appear to meet some of these criteria in certain contexts or in certain periods of their life, but in order to fit the criteria for a personality disorder, it needs to be consistent across their life. And that's one of the key things that is important to remember as well, because a lot of people who are abusive to their partners or to other people in their lives are very good at masking that quality or performing very differently in other areas of their life. And somebody who actually has narcissistic personality disorder is eventually going to show up the same way in all their relationships because their needs are consistently the same across the board. It's very difficult to get the entire list of criteria onto a small slide, but some of the key things are that the identity is completely dependent on others. They're forming their identity and how they present based on the likelihood that this presentation is going to garner them the admiration or the attention that they desire from that other person. There's a consistent lack of self-direction and need for approval or adulation from others. And they will have either excessively high or low standards for their self. And as many of you mentioned, impairments in intimacy and empathy, significant impairment. And most importantly, the traits are stable across time and place, and they're not better explained by their developmental stage, use of substances, or some kind of high stress life event or a medical condition. All of those would just be other things, not narcissistic personality disorder. That said, even within that limited criteria, it can present in some different ways that are important to mention because we are used to hearing of the sort of I'm the best, I'm always a winner, grandiose presentation of narcissism. But there's another presentation that we can discuss as covert or vulnerable narcissism, where the person is actually going to come across as highly self-deprecating. They're going to be very open about their very low self-esteem, but there's still a kind of exceptionalism, like I'm the worst, I cannot function at all on my own. And the result on the person that they're pulling in is the same, because whether the grandiose person might be implying that their partner is lucky to be with them, or if it's a boss, that their employee is lucky to work there and they should, be grateful even for the very bad treatment that they're receiving. The covert or vulnerable narcissist will be using that their very low sense of self-worth as a reason that they cannot be left alone. They need that attention. They need that person, and that everything is going to fall apart if that person does not shore them up and reassure them and constantly feed that need for admiration and attention. So just the question that we mentioned, narcissistic abuse versus just general abuse. What's the difference? Is there a difference? Does anyone have any thoughts on this question? I think we can move on, maybe also because I kind of partially answered this before. But despite the sort of popularity of the term narcissistic abuse that's lately kind of shown up a lot on social media and different kind of online discussion boards, and even in books and other kind of longer media, there's no specific abusive tactics that only narcissists use that nobody else uses. if abuse is abuse, regardless of where it's coming from, what the diagnoses are of the person who is using those abusive tactics. And obviously a diagnosis is not an excuse for abuse. If someone in your life is abusing you emotionally, physically, financially, sexually, psychologically, it does not matter whether or not they have narcissistic personality disorder. Abuse is always wrong. And understanding the possibility of this person being narcissistic is going to provide you with some information about how that person operates and what kind of responses are likely to be effective or ineffective with them, but it's not likely to determine for you like the level of abuse you are suffering, whether it is abuse or isn't abuse. Abuse is abuse. And there's some people in the field who actually believe that terming it narcissistic abuse is not the most helpful because it kind of removes focus away from the fact that we know violence against women and abuse is very heavily tied to patriarchy and misogyny, which are social structural issues. And when we start talking about a diagnosis as the basis for abuse, it kind of lets society off the hook a little bit, because now it's not a social problem, it's an individual problem. At the same time, there's a reason that a lot of people who are dealing with abuse in their lives or who are feeling confused about their interactions with certain partner, an intimate partner, or even somebody else who potentially has power over them, like a boss or a landlord or another family member. There's a reason that people are seeking out these resources and that they're trying to, and sometimes finding things in them that help them to make sense of their situation. So if people can respond in the chat with what you think might be helpful or not for somebody in an unhealthy or abusive relationship to learn about narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder.
We have a question in the chat, but also I think the slides aren't updated. Like it's still
okay.
on the definition and criteria.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's always changed. Okay, hold on.
Now it's on the like slide with the question. So the question is on the screen. How helpful is it for someone in an unhealthy or abusive relationship to evaluate if their partner is a narcissist? And then one of the questions that we have is if the regular abuser is sorry or regrets after like abusing you or an action or abusive action or behavior, are they a narcissist or not?
So again, this is another thing that it is not going to help make a distinction between the narcissist and the quote unquote regular abuser. So anybody who is abusive to their partners is somebody who has learned that that's what they need to do in order to get their needs met or in order to feel safe in a relationship. Again, that's not an excuse, but it's understanding the context of how these behaviors and presentations develop. It usually comes from really early or prolonged developmental trauma. And that's why we say that while most people who grow up being abused or witnessing abuse do not go on to abuse other people, there are no people who abuse others who were never abused or neglected themselves. So there's always going to be some kind of history that leads to this behavior of needing to have control over the partner in order to calm their own anxieties and insecurities. And actually, in both the case of a regular abuser and a narcissist, there's going to be a cycle where they first, when we talk about narcissists, often you hear idolize, devalue, discard. But after that discard portion, the narcissist will usually still reach out to the person unless they've replaced them with kind of a new person to fill that same role. They will reach out to pull that person back in because they're feeling the loss or the lack of that attention and that they need, or that they feel they need, in order to feel somewhat secure or more stable or safe. And the same thing would be true for somebody who is abusing their partner. They may even be genuinely sorry, but they're going to be in this cycle where they need to feel control over the person. So first they're going to pull them in with the attention and the love bombing that we talked about last night. And then in order to maintain their sense of control over that person, they may start to treat them differently in order to establish that they're the person with the most power. And then when that abuse or that control leads to the person caring less for that partner or wanting to end the relationship, then they're going to be very sorry and sad and beg the person to come back. And it's the same reason. Both people are dealing with that huge anxiety around attachment and around intimate relationships. You might see more extreme presentations of it in somebody who meets the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, because they're on the most extreme end of the spectrum of what we call disorganized attachment. But the general patterns are going to be consistent regardless of whether this person has the diagnosis of narcissism, has a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, or has any number of other mental health diagnoses.
Okay, we have a couple of more comments here. So someone said that it might be helpful for the other person to realize behavioral patterns of their abuser. And while it can be helpful to understand to some extent, the abuse is still abuse, whether it's narcissistic or not. And someone else said it's super helpful to know so that they don't blame themselves, but more importantly, it helps them to learn how to deal with the abuse. I think that's, yeah. And then we have another response that said, I think that every human being has unhealthy behavior. The difference is that in some or most situations, the unhealthy behavior of a person can be changed, unlike someone who has NAR.
So they're talking about narcissism.
Narcissistic. Okay. Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a challenge for them, and it will be unlikely for them to change. And so I'm going to read all the comments first, and then the few questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I heard once that not all abusers are having narcissistic disorder. They might only have some narcissistic traits. Okay, that was what the question. How many of the criteria should be met to consider this person is narcissist? And then I'm reading The Muslim Narcissist, which is a book, I presume, and it mentioned that we all have some narcissistic traits, but depending on the degree, and the difference between a narcissist and a non-narcissist is the empathy. Do you think that's true?
So
you want to respond to that first?
Yeah, so actually I'm going to continue because the next slides are going to address some of the questions here and also represent some of the comments that we've gotten as well. So the big thing that I really want to say is, like, if you're somebody who has been in a relationship or is in a relationship which has been harmful or abusive, and you found resources on narcissism to be very helpful to you, to provide you the strength you needed to end the relationship or to understand that it wasn't your fault, definitely keep that and hold on to that. We don't want to take that away from you. That is one of the things that can be helpful about researching any area of human behavior or diagnoses. So understanding your partner's behavior, understanding why pleading your case won't help. Some people
slide hasn't updated. Yeah.
It's very slow today.
Yeah.
Has it now? It looks like it has on.
It's on the helpful. Yeah.
Okay, great. Oops, and now I accidentally went forward. So, like we said, it can also reduce the false hope that we often have that our partner is definitely going to change or get better if we understand that what they're dealing with is a very serious condition that is going to be extremely difficult for them to change. And it can help you to understand and process experiences that didn't make sense in other contexts with people who are able to kind of listen and absorb information and receive criticism. And it can also be a gateway to understanding the overall patterns of abuse. Maybe you start off learning about narcissism, but then you kind of learn about abuse in general, and that helps you to understand your experiences. Those are all ways that it can be helpful to learn more about narcissism when you're trying to figure out what's going on in an unhealthy relationship. Now we move on to what's unhelpful. I can't emphasize enough that as a clinician who is trained to offer diagnoses to people that I'm treating, I'm only allowed to diagnose people that I am actively treating, and I cannot treat somebody that I have a personal relationship with. It's not only an ethical conflict, but it's understood that that compromises my ability to evaluate what is truly going on with this person. So trying to diagnose the person that you are with, or the person that you're working with, or this person who is causing harm and disarray in your life is not a particularly productive project, because you're not qualified to diagnose them. If you were qualified to diagnose them, you would be excluded from diagnosing them by virtue of the fact that they're your partner or a member of your family. And as we mentioned earlier, the number of people who actually meet the full criteria for narcissistic personality disorder are a very small percentage of the population. So when you get very focused on whether your partner is a narcissist or not, it can take away focus from the important question of how you feel in the relationship, how much hope there is in the relationship for change to happen, for growth to happen, or for it to be safe for you. And it kind of keeps you stuck. So a lot of people are going to be, because so few people meet the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, a lot of people out there are going to be reading those resources, reading about the criteria, and it's not going to fit exactly. And they're going to kind of get stuck there in that place of deciding, well, today they seem like a narcissist, but the other day they seemed like maybe they weren't. Instead of moving on to these important questions of what is going to be healthy and safe for you to do in this relationship. And that moves on to like the most important piece here. People can be very unhealthy or unsafe partners without meeting criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. And it should also be mentioned that somebody can be an unhealthy or incompatible partner for you without even being abusive. So when we're so hung up on whether this person is a narcissist, we're really, really moving far away from the important questions we need to be asking ourselves about a relationship that we're in. Abusive behavior and abusive men in particular are much more common than narcissists. So focusing just on this one diagnosis tends to distract from our social obligation to fight misogyny at every level, not just when it's occurring in a particular narcissist. I also think there's an additional thing where it can give you a false sense of security. Like if you really know about narcissists and you know techniques to deal with them, that you're going to be safe, or you're going to be able to avoid abuse, or you're going to be able to avoid unhealthy relationships. And in fact, those are not the skills. That's like a very tiny fraction of the skills that you need in order to look out for your own safety and health in relationships. Your efforts and your energy would be much better put toward working on understanding overall relationship health and overall red flags, green flags, and being in tune with your own sense of what is helpful or what's unhelpful. That said, we do have a little bit of guidance on what to do if you suspect your partner, and I'm using partner, but it can be somebody else in your life as well, is a narcissist. So first, if you suspect that your partner is a narcissist, do seek out support from a trauma-informed therapist. Again, that person will not be able to evaluate or diagnose your partner, but what you will get is a place away from that partner's influence, chaos, confusion, so that you can think clearly about the relationship, about your safety, about your health, and what you want to do next. They might also be able to help connect you to resources similarly to what we do at Pillars of Peace. If you're feeling confused, we would be an additional place that you could reach out to talk it through with us so that you can get a kind of neutral and expert neutral response to be able to think through what's really going on. At the same time, don't depend on the diagnosis. Your relationship is much more complex than a single diagnosis. It's much more important to evaluate the current and past behaviors and conversations, as well as your own feelings, to understand whether this is a relationship that can proceed, that can become healthy, or whether it is healthy or is unhealthy. Like we said, sometimes research on these other topics can still be helpful to you as you're exploring and figuring out what's going on in your relationship. Try to make sure that they're coming from reputable sources. There's all kinds of listicles on the internet about narcissism, and only some of them are even written by clinicians, and clinicians are not infallible either. So take some time to figure out what's really useful out there and what's accurate, and only keep reading them if you're finding them helpful. If you find that the confusion is increasing or that it's making you feel even more hopeless or disturbed, then maybe that is not a helpful resource for you. Again, if you are indeed in an abusive relationship or in a relationship with a narcissist, what you most need is to rebuild your sense of trust in your own judgments and decision-making. So it can be really tempting when we are under somebody else's control or influence in an unhealthy or abusive relationship to look for something else that's just going to tell us what to do, because we've been kind of trained by that relationship or by that experience not to trust our own judgment. But rebuilding our sense of our own judgment and decision-making is actually the most important thing to do in dealing with and recovering from abuse. Again, safety planning is just as important when dealing with a narcissist, somebody who meets the criteria of a narcissistic personality disorder, as with any other form of abuse. Just as we describe that abusers tend to retaliate or escalate when the victim separates or when there's a loss of control, the same thing is true for somebody who has narcissistic personality disorder. When they lose that control, when they lose that source of admiration or attention, there can be an escalation in aggressive or violent behavior, or there could be retaliation. So the same need to work on safety planning is there in both cases, and it does not change. Also,
just
yes,
the slides haven't moved again.
okay. It's so slow.
Yeah.
Okay, is it showing now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just stick to the audience window. So the second piece is that don't assume that like resources you read. I know that there are books and resources out there that say like how to deal with narcissists and things like that. They're very catchy. They're very seductive because it seems like it's arming you with some kind of like special skills that are going to keep you protected from dangerous people. But the truth is that if you are in a relationship that is abusive with somebody who does have narcissistic personality disorder, even some of these methods are still going to be potentially, you still have to be evaluated for safety in each situation. Some people talk about this gray rock method of just like providing very boring, neutral responses and not giving the attention that the person is seeking or craving. But if you have been that person's primary supply of attention and admiration up to that point, it can provoke the same level of reaction as if you had separated from that person. So there's no universal like tactic for how to deal with a narcissistic person. It is always going to come down to what are your resources, what is your particular situation, and how can you safety plan around potentially exiting that relationship if that is what's going on and it's unsafe for you. So we will have another deeper dive into attachment theory in a future presentation and attachment styles. But I did want to at least leave you all with something that is a little bit more useful and applicable to everyone than in terms of understanding relationship health and relationship dynamics than the very specific and narrow definition of narcissistic personality disorder. So basically, to sum it up, DSM diagnoses only apply to some of the people, some of the time. Even if that person has received an official diagnosis, it could be wrong. We know that neurodivergent folks, like people on the autism spectrum, tend to be misdiagnosed very frequently with the personality disorders because in certain lights or in certain contexts, it can present as if that's what's going on, when really there's a completely different situation going on, and people with autism are actually at an increased risk of being abused by other people, not necessarily abusing others. Attachment theory, which relates to how all of us learn relationship health from our early caregivers, and then how we build our ability to be secure in relationships, applies to everyone. And it can be, to a certain extent, evaluated within a relationship, though if you're feeling especially confused about what's going on, again, it's never a bad idea to seek out professional support. And the additional piece that's missing from a DSM diagnosis is that attachment theory also allows us to understand ourselves and our role in the dynamic. Now, I'm not talking about whether somebody who's being abused is playing a role in their abuse. That's not what we're saying. There's never an excuse for abuse, and the responsibility for abuse falls very squarely on the shoulders of the person who is abusing the other. But if there is confusion or an unhealthy dynamic in a relationship, it can be very helpful, and we can get a lot more clarity on what's going on with our partner if we have a good understanding of ourselves. And attachment theory allows us to do that. And I find that it's very helpful actually for a lot of people who are confused in relationships, because it provides a sense of being able to know for sure which things relate to them and which things relate to their partner. So a brief introduction to attachment theory. And this is, I was complaining about, the social media's take on mental health, but this account in particular is run by a licensed couples therapist and has one of the better, I won't endorse like blanket everything that she ever posts, but she has very good resources on attachment theory. So if you'd like to explore it more, it's a good place to start. And particularly if you do your own research on attachment theory, something to look out for is do not stick with any resource that deals with attachment styles as if that is the person's destiny or their overall personality. We all have the capacity to move closer toward a secure attachment. It's just that people who are particularly extreme on the disorganized end of the spectrum, it's going to be that much harder for them to get there because of how significant their distress is. And this is why it's also helpful to think about it in these terms as opposed to just thinking about narcissism, because even if our partner doesn't meet the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, if they have a very disorganized attachment, even though they may have the ability or the possibility of moving more towards a secure attachment, they're not going to get there easily. And it may mean that they are going to be an unsafe partner for a significant period of time, even if they really want to change. It may just be so overwhelmingly painful and distressing to give up the kind of coping skills that they've learned early in their lives that they just can't do it. And this is often a more helpful way for people to relate to their partners than to just think about, is this person a narcissist or is this person an abuser? Because if this is somebody that we already love and care for deeply, we may feel a lot of resistance to labeling them with these terms. And I wouldn't say that that's a bad thing, because that's part of our ability to have empathy for somebody else's suffering. But when we are able to look clearly at how difficult it is for this person to move toward being a safe partner, then we have a better sense of how possible it is for us to stay in the relationship, to be safe, and to have the kind of relationship that we are seeking for ourselves. And so I just also wanted to point out that all of the personality disorder diagnoses are going to show up in people, or rather, anybody who has a personality disorder diagnosis or meets the criteria is going to show up as being on that extreme end of the disorganized attachment spectrum. They may be in very different places because it is a spectrum. So you could be at the furthest end, or you could be somewhere between being anxious and disorganized. But this is much more applicable to a broader range of people than just these specific diagnoses. And the additional thing that I want to say is, as a clinician, I'm personally not a fan of any of the personality disorder diagnoses, because they come with these, I think some of you have mentioned it, this saying that, oh, somebody with a personality disorder can't change. We know now, and we know from significant amount of research, that people with personality disorders, or people who've been diagnosed with them, are people who have been through extreme amounts of abuse or neglect, or both, during their developmental years. And if they are provided with the appropriate support and they're able to access it without being completely overwhelmed, they can change. Diagnoses that don't help us to help people are not very useful, even on the side of the helping professional. So it may be helpful because they describe patterns of behavior that can help you make sense of a relationship. But beyond that, it's not going to tell you whether there's hope for your relationship or not. That's something that you really need to determine based on whether you're safe, whether you have the resources you need, and with support, ideally from some professionals who can listen to you and help you to think that through on your own. And again, I want to emphasize that it's much more important to evaluate if it's possible to be in a safe, rewarding relationship with someone than it is to just evaluate whether they're a narcissist or even evaluate whether they are an abuser. Because a relationship can be unhealthy without being abusive. A relationship can be abusive. A partner can be abusive without being a narcissist. And there are even a number of people out there who might have this diagnosis or have some of the presentation of it, but actually are in that category of people who are working on the trauma that they experienced and are not abusive to their partners or do not engage in relationships at all. So the most important thing is to be looking at the overall health of your relationship and your safety. So, like I said, we're planning to have an additional event in the future focused on attachment. So look out for that. This would be after the holiday weekend. And we will be starting soon a program for adults who grew up with DV in the home. It looks like a really wide age range. That's because anybody within those ages is eligible. And then depending on the interest, we may split it up into multiple groups. The Instagram account that I shared is from the therapist Julie Manano. It's, I think, the best resource for free, publicly available graphics and explanations of attachment styles. And there is a very popular book that many people are reading. Some of you may have read, called Attached. I would say to take that with a bit of a grain of salt because they tend to be very harsh on people with an avoidant attachment style. And we'll talk about that more at that future event. But really, nobody's attachment style is their fault. It's the result of their early experiences with caregivers. So making it seem as if a particular attachment style other than secure is better than the other doesn't really make sense. The only best attachment style is secure, and all of us can take steps to move toward being more secure, although we cannot do it in all relationships because it might not be safe we can't be secure with somebody who is an unhealthy or unsafe partner. And obviously, take any online quizzes with a grain of salt. And now we can open up for some additional questions and discussion. Okay, so somebody had, I think Mia had asked, do narcissists ever feel the need to want to get better, seek therapy, get marriage counseling? So like I mentioned, and like you can see from the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, somebody who has this presentation has built up a lot of walls to protect them from having to deal with this deep-seated sense of low self-worth or even self-loathing that all the grandiosity or exceptionalism is covering up. And so that can be a huge barrier to that person being able to seek help, because asking somebody who's developed these kind of protections and developed this really horrible sense of self to the extent that they now qualify for the criteria, asking that person to go to therapy or to let down some of those walls or to be vulnerable in a way that isn't just calculated to get attention would be like asking, a regular person to go walk through a bonfire. It is something that is extremely painful and overwhelming, but it's not entirely impossible. It can happen. People who have really decided that this is what's working for them are less likely to do that. people who are experiencing some kind of turmoil or difficulty. They're seeing that it's not working out. They're not able to hold on to the victim or the source of their admiration or attention long enough, and they keep having to look elsewhere. Those people are maybe more likely to seek out some help. Which brings me to the next point, which is that sometimes just the possibility that somebody could potentially get better or could seek out help is not a reason to continue in a relationship, particularly if that relationship is one that is physically or emotionally unsafe for the other partner. Because from your side, you need to prioritize their safety. And then from their side, not losing that relationship is kind of like giving them the ability to continue as they are without having to confront the fact that this system that they've created isn't actually working for them. But again, that applies to people across the board who engage in unhealthy, harmful, or abusive relationship patterns, not just people who fit this very narrow criteria of narcissistic personality disorder. Thank you all for making the time to join us, especially, late on a wintry evening, and leading into the holiday weekend. I hope it was helpful and informative. And if you find that after today's discussion, you have even more questions, or you're concerned about something that's going on in your own life or the life of somebody you know, please don't hesitate to reach out to us either at that helpline, or you can reach out to Temenna, or you can reach out to me specifically regarding counseling inquiries. And yes, we will follow up, I think with an email, either probably tomorrow during the day, with the links to both yesterday's recording and this one. If there's no more questions, and everyone's had a chance to take down our contact information, I will stop the recording and end the webinar for the evening. Oh, wait. Okay, one more question.
I was gonna text it, but never mind, I'll just say it. So the book that I referred earlier on, so I'm in a book club with an organization, maybe you've heard of it, it's called FACE, F-A-C-E. And so they're holding a book club, and the book that we're reading for this month is called The Muslim Narcissist. And so I wanted to ask, have you read that book? What's your insight, or no?
I haven't read it yet. I'd be curious to look into it. It seems like an interesting angle. Who's the author? Do you have it?
Mona, I think she's a doctor because she has a PhD at the
Yeah.
end. Mona Al-Yidrisi. I'm butchering her last name, but it's I can type it.
That's okay.
Oh,
Yeah, sure. Share it with the group. I think
Yeah, I'll copy and paste a thing.
a lot of the literature on narcissism comes from this sort of the psychopathology framework, where kind of we're analyzing people and diagnosing with them with disorders. That's kind of the medical framework where psychology and therapy got started. It's not the most helpful framework for every person, but that doesn't mean that there isn't helpful information that can be gotten from those sources. So kind of like as we re-examine different fields like psychology and social work and see what has worked well in the past and what hasn't, we don't have to like throw out everything that's there. But I think it is also helpful to talk about, I'm not sure the focus of the book, The Muslim Narcissist, but it is helpful to talk about how different terms like these, or clusters or constellations of issues, can present in different communities and different cultural contexts, because that has also historically been one of the issues with specifically the DSM diagnosis compendium, but with other areas as well, that sometimes people were getting diagnosed with, schizophrenia just because somebody didn't understand like a context of a cultural belief in spirits or something like that. So I'd be very curious to read this book. And perhaps, yes. So one additional question was if it's common for a narcissist to make the other feel like they are the one in the wrong, they are the problem, they need to seek help. So somebody with narcissistic personality disorder is going to need to maintain that sense of exceptionalism. And particularly if they're on the grandiose end of the spectrum, then it's going to feel completely overwhelming and annihilating for this person to ever admit fault, ever to be wrong. And so what they're going to do instead is to flip it on the other person. However, again, this is something that you can often see with other abusive partners who are not necessarily like meeting the criteria for narcissism. That's why we talk about tactics like gaslighting, or convincing the other person that they're imagining things, that in fact they're the crazy one, they're the abusive one, they're the narcissistic one, because this person has such incredible difficulty dealing with those negative emotions. They have no capacity for it. Their whole coping method is to just ward off those kinds of feelings, either by avoiding discussions about them, by building themselves up to be really great, or by aggressively kind of attacking the other person. So grandiose is is just a fancy term really for having an inflated sense of self, or thinking that you are the best. Like Trump is a very good example of this, where, it didn't matter how many people actually came to the inauguration. He still had to insist that it was the most people that ever came to an inauguration ever. That's grandiosity, where like, not only do you have to constantly toot your own horn, but there's like a divergence from reality some of the time in this representation of how great you are or how important you are. It can show up in more subtle ways too. In fact, we even talk about other things that can lead to grandiosity, like vicarious trauma can make people think like, I'm the only person who can help these people. And that's grandiose too, because there's a lot, problems are complex. But the person who has narcissistic personality disorder is going to have that grandiosity very consistently across their lifespan, across their relationships, in different contexts of their life. And also, there was a question about projecting. So yes and no. So gaslighting is usually when you are telling the other person that it's an umbrella term covering everything that you're doing to alter that person's perception of reality and make that person mistrust their own perception of reality. Projecting would be one particular tactic in that, but it's also helpful to note that these things, projecting is not necessarily something that people do consciously. So even though they're doing it, it's having a negative impact. It might be something that they're just that they're naturally doing subconsciously as part of their own personal set of defense mechanisms. In order to protect myself from criticism, I instead look for the problem in the person who's talking to me and say that actually they're the one who has the problem that they're describing. And this can be very disorienting in a relationship and is a huge barrier to being able to have open or healthy communication together, which is why I say that even if that person doesn't meet the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, and in fact, even if they are not, their treatment of you or their behavior in the relationship doesn't rise all the way to the level of abuse, somebody who cannot have a conversation about problems or concerns or criticism without projecting, without being completely defensive, without going in these cycles, is somebody who's going to be very difficult to have a healthy relationship with.
We have a question about the show Inventing Anna and if she has narcissistic personality disorder or
I have not watched it, although it does look very entertaining. I don't know. She might or she might not. And particularly because I'm not treating her, the real person, I don't think that I would be qualified to say. It's very likely, though, that somebody who goes around engaging in these kind of behaviors is somebody who does have a disorganized attachment of some kind. That is something that's a little bit easier to determine, because somebody who feels very secure in themselves and in their relationships is not going to feel the need to pretend to be something other than what they are, or to build up a whole version of themselves. And actually, one thing that is important to note here is that I don't know the details of Anna's case, but people who are engaging in scamming or fraudulent behavior for financial gain, it can just be about the money. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that they have some kind of psychological disorder along with it. Although I have some opinions about like indiscriminate acquisition of wealth and whether that's a healthy thing. But just for general purposes, committing crimes does not necessarily mean that you have a disorder. And you might engage, if your whole plan for financial gain is to convince people that you are very wealthy and it's easy for them to rely on you, like as an investment, you can engage in lots of behaviors that look like dissociative identity disorder or borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder, but really what you're doing is just trying to accomplish your goal of acquiring money from other people or wealth through other people through fraudulent means. So someone shared an example of an experience with someone who used to have conversations and apologize, like in the beginning of the relationship, and then later had a sudden shift with constantly blaming them, telling them they're making a big deal out of nothing when they pointed out some word or action that hurt them, and asking, is that narcissism? By itself, I wouldn't say that it's narcissism. It's not a healthy relationship behavior. It's something that's concerning about the ability to communicate and to be able to progress in the relationship. But by itself, it doesn't necessarily mean that that person is a narcissist. It may mean that they don't have the skills to deal with criticism in a healthy way. It may mean that they have some opinions about what marriage is supposed to be like that are not healthy or that are not in alignment with yours. But by itself, it wouldn't be enough to diagnose the person with narcissism. And again, like what the description is talking about, if they do have aspects of grandiosity and they're often criticizing the person about their body, these are really abusive behaviors that demean the second person, make them feel bad, reduce their sense of self-worth, and in the dynamic of power and control can create a sense where that person is under control of the first person who's determining like what is worthy of criticism and what's not. Again, if this is something that you're experiencing now or in the past, I would really encourage you to reach out to us for support. And if it turns out that we're not in your area, or there's some reason why we can't proceed with you, we would help you to connect to resources that are appropriate for you. This is exactly why we decided to hold this webinar, is because getting stuck on the question of whether it's narcissism or whether it's not can take you away from this important question of, is this a healthy or safe relationship for you to be in? And if it's not, then what do you do? And those questions are what we and other organizations are really here to help people answer, so that you can be safe and you can eventually seek or cultivate healthy relationships in the future. And so then there was one additional question of whether Pillars of Peace does counseling from an Islamic perspective. So I'm the therapist, the main therapist who's providing counseling from Pillars of Peace. So while I wouldn't say that we are providing Islamic counseling, because that's specifically something where the counselors tend to have a dual degree. They've completed studies in Islam, and they've also completed studies in counseling. What we do provide is counseling that is sensitive to an understanding of your values, the many different values of members of the Muslim community. So while I wouldn't provide guidance on spiritual issues, that's something that you could seek from Imam Khalid or Sheikh Fayaz or other resources at the ICNYU. We are providing a space where we are very clear that abuse does not come from, let me rephrase this, while misogyny and patriarchy have a role in all of the cultures or most of the cultures in the world, and they have influenced the way that certain structures or cultural structures and community structures operate. Your culture, your religion, your identity is never the reason for abuse. And so that's something that we really are strongly emphasizing, that misogyny and patriarchal kind of strongholds are a different issue, separate from your own values, your own religion, your own cultural practices, which we know vary significantly across many different Muslim communities. Okay, I think now it is getting very late, so we want to thank all of you who've hung on here and shared your questions and your thoughts with us. And if there's anything additional, please reach out to us at the helpline or at our individual emails, and continue to follow us or sign up for the newsletter, like Tamanda mentioned, on the website to find out about upcoming events that we'll be putting on. Thank you again, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Have a good night.